Good morning, and everyone, welcome. My name is Emily. It's my pleasure to serve as the Administrative Director for the William Southam Journalism Fellowships here at Massey College. On behalf of Massey, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that it remains home to many Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from all across Turtle Island. It's a privilege for us to gather here today in a spirit of learning, dialogue, and shared responsibility. So since 2019, the German-Canadian Media Symposium has served as a cornerstone of the long-standing partnership between the German consulate in Toronto and Massey College. Over the years, this series has invited journalists, scholars, and media professionals from Canada and Germany to grapple with some of the most urgent questions facing our democracies. We've explored the tensions between truth and misinformation, interrogated the emotional and political landscape of the pandemic, reflected on the ways COVID-19 has reshaped societies, examined how journalists counter war propaganda, and considered the ethical and practical challenges of reporting from zones of extreme polarization and conflict. Most recently, the symposium engaged deeply with the complexities of covering the Middle East and the responsibilities that journalists bear when reporting on rapidly evolving and deeply contested events. Each year, this gathering has demonstrated the importance of transnational dialogue and the value of learning from one another's media ecosystems. Today's discussion continues that tradition. It is my pleasure to now welcome this morning the Consul General of the Federal Republic of Germany in Toronto, Anne Wagner-Mitchell. Consul General Wagner-Mitchell brings to this conversation more than 2 decades of distinguished diplomatic service. She has served in postings around the world, including Ghana, Palestine, and Vienna, and held senior leadership roles at the Federal Foreign Office in Berlin, and most recently completed her term as Germany's ambassador to Zambia before joining us in Toronto in July. She holds advanced legal degrees from institutions in Germany, France, and the UK, and received her doctorate in law from the University of Munster. We are honored to have you here with us today and grateful for the continued partnership and support of the German consulate in bringing this symposium to life each year. Please join me in welcoming Consul General Anne Wagner-Mitchell.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning to you all. It's also my pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is jointly kind of organized by the Massey College and the German Consulate General. And our cooperation, as Emily has alluded to, with the Massey College and specifically with the William Southam Journalism Fellow Program dates back many years. For those of you who are not the fellows and who are not familiar with the program, the fellow program is targeted at mid-career journalists with an interest in stepping out of their day-to-day work for about a year and being able to dive deeper into political, social, or economic topics of their interests here at the Massey College. And we thought this is also for us an exciting target group to promote media relations between Germany and Canada. Did you know, by the way, that neither the CBC nor any other big Canadian media house, electronic or print, has a correspondent in Germany? And I think the only CBC office in Europe is in London, which is not even the EU, as we all know. But to be fair, there is also hardly any German journalists based in Canada. This may change, which has more to do with the administration south of the border, as you would call it here. If they start implementing their announced policy of giving journalists only an 8-month visa with only one possibility of renewing it, we may see that international journalists eventually move from the US to Canada to cover both countries and hopefully giving more attention also to Canada in Europe and the other way around. Obviously there is truly a gap in reporting and journalism coverage when it comes to German-Canadian or Canadian-German relations. And this at a time of geopolitical uncertainties, where things that we took for granted for many years and decades are just not the same anymore, and where German-Canadian relations stand out, being based on a reliable partnership, on shared values, and an already diverse cooperation. And at the moment, there are very good reasons on both sides to actively try to collaborate even more in all sectors, be it defense and security, business and investment, fighting climate change, and so on and so forth. But we need to have an open mindset on both sides of the Atlantic to become more interested in working together. And this is why we find it highly important that there is more intensified media coverage in Canada about Germany and in Germany about Canada. And this is where our cooperation with the Massey College Journalism Fellowship Program comes in. The goal of our cooperation is to familiarize, and particularly the fellows, with the German media landscape and with German perspectives on current events, and to promote exchange with German colleagues. And to this end, we are organizing, among other activities, events like today, where today we will hear a presentation on challenges to political reporting from a German point of view, making a lot of reference to current issues under debate in Germany. And we are very privileged to have Thorsten Faas as our keynote speaker or presenter today. Thorsten Faas is mostly a professor of political sociology of the Federal Republic of Germany at the Otto Suhr Institute of Political Science at the Free University of Berlin. And definitely, I think, one of the most prestigious, or the most prestigious, political science faculty in Germany. But currently, Thorsten Faas is a visiting professor at the Center of European and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto. He holds the Hannah Arendt Visiting Chair for German and European Studies, which is funded by the German government through the German Academic Exchange Service. Thorsten Faas' research focuses on electoral politics and campaign communications, particularly as they relate to young people and German elections. He is, for example, one of the principal investigators of the German longitudinal election study, and this is a long-term, large-scale scientific research project that examines voting behavior and political attitudes in Germany. He is also very active in comparative study of electoral system, and his academic articles have been published in many renowned political science journals on both sides of the Atlantic, including the American Political Science Review, the European Journal of Political Research, the International Journal of Public Opinion and Research, and German Politics, to mention just a few. I don't think I have to say more. Thorsten Faas is an expert to discuss the state of German politics today, including the shifting role of youth and the media in a society of increased political polarization. And with this short introduction, I hand it over to you, Thorsten. I'm sure he will provide us with an inspiring presentation that will lead us into an interesting discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction to having me here. It's a great privilege to be in Toronto for this year. As has just been mentioned, I'm usually based in Berlin at the Free University and at the Otto Suhr Institute there. Otto Suhr used to be the mayor of Berlin, actually, just before Willy Brandt, who later would become the German chancellor, would become the mayor of Berlin. But Otto Suhr was also a political scientist in a way. He was one of the leading figures in actually founding political science in Germany in the decades before that. And that's kind of the spirit that we try to keep up at the Free University, being academics there, of course, in a very traditional political science sense, but also being part of public discourses there. As has just been mentioned, a lot of things happen with respect to media dynamics, with respect to political dynamics. Some of them are very beneficial, others might be seen as more problematic. So again, it's really a great privilege, and I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to speak a little bit about our research here today. So thank you very much for the invitation and also for providing this very nice setting for this morning's event here. Challenges to political reporting, a view from on Germany. Again, I am a political scientist, so this is the perspective I mostly have. I'm interested in voters, how they make up their mind, but of course, in making up their mind, they ultimately need information. They rely on accurate, factual information. They should have a decent amount of political information to ultimately cast informed choices, but there are really key challenges there that we have in democracies in Germany, but also in other parts of the world. But I will mostly give you some views, some perspectives from the work that we've done in Germany, but I'm very, very much looking forward to the exchange that we're hopefully going to have afterwards when it comes to the comparative part, because I really think it's crucial, as it has been mentioned already, that we do compare, that we do understand each other, that we do understand that things can be done in very, very different ways, and that doesn't necessarily mean that either one is automatically better, but we should just compare it and understand it and take on different perspectives. I think that is really crucial. So if I speak mostly on Germany, please see that as an introduction to think about other ways how things can be done. I have the pleasure to have this position as a political sociologist of the Federal Republic of Germany. I'm not really happy with that position I have in that sense by name. I'm very happy with the position I have there, but not necessarily with the name, because it somehow suggests that we have a different political sociology of Germany there, but it's really just a different context, I would say. Maybe the challenges are somewhat different, but of course the challenges are not necessarily Germans, and maybe the solutions are not necessarily Germans, but there might be broader aspects to that. I will present you, to challenge you maybe a little bit, I will present 5 theses that kind of are inspired from the work we've been doing with respect to the relationship between politics and media. That is a crucial relationship, of course, and I hope we can engage based on that in an interesting and inspiring discussion afterwards. Some background, though, maybe, because some of the hypotheses or these theses I will use might rely on some political science jargon there, so let me introduce you briefly, at least, to these words. A very, very basic perspective on politics that we use, that we basically teach our students the very first minute they arrive at the university, is that maybe politics is really a multidimensional thing, and that we might have to take into account that politics is really a multidimensional concept, and we usually differentiate between these 3 aspects, that there's a polity aspect, basically the constitution, the institutional setting within which politics then takes place. So it's really the basic foundation of a political system, more or less. More interesting and more relevant for my talk today will be the other 2, politics and policy. Politics referring to this idea that it's a process, ultimately, that it takes elections, for example, it takes campaigns, it takes negotiations, it might take, depending on the political system you're looking at, it might take coalitions to find together, to come together with possibly very different partners, but they might ultimately have to work together. And this process-oriented perspective we would usually refer to as politics, in contrast to the kind of substantial perspective. Ultimately, politics is about authoritative allocation of values. That's a famous phrase by political scientist David Easton, who would argue that ultimately what politics does, or what the outcome of political processes is, that decisions are taken authoritatively, and that means they're all binding for all of us. So policy could be foreign policy, social policy, defense policy, but it would be the substance of politics. And maybe that already gives you an idea that there might be tension with respect to reporting. Should we report, or are people interested in the process, or are they more interested in the ultimate outcomes? To what extent do they have to understand the processes? I'll come back to that later, but I will use this threefold distinction, especially the distinction between politics and policy, in my talk at several of the hypotheses or the theses I will present to you in a minute. Another thing that we might have to keep in mind, or that we should keep in mind, is that this is the famous phrase by Abraham Lincoln, of course, that democracy as a form of government is government of the people, by the people, but also for the people. And especially the aspect of by the people, I mean, that's quite a burden for citizens, for ordinary citizens, as you find it sometimes in the literature, to be part of this government process, to ultimately cast votes and by that influence political decision making. We would want that people know what they're doing, that they know what they have in mind, that they act in a rational way, whatever that means specifically. But that's a key prerequisite of democracies, and again, something that we should keep in mind, and also something that we can look at empirically. And I will present some empirical data from our research projects in a minute. There's another political science, and I'll stop then with these references to more or less famous political scientists, but Robert Dahl definitely is one of the most famous ones. He has come up with this idea of a polyarchy, which for him is an empirical implementation of the idea of democracy, a very thin one actually. But even in that very thin conception of democracy, Robert Dahl would argue that it takes two things to speak of a democracy in its literal meaning, and that would be contestation. So there has to be some contestation among elites, among parties, among candidates, and on the part of citizens, the right to participate. And I'm stressing that because the contestation part there also means that you have to know something about these parties. You have to know something about the politicians. You have to know what they stand for. And that, again, requires some sort of information, some sort of founding of individuals' vote choices that might have been there at some previous time, but maybe it's an open question to what extent people actually have the necessary knowledge to ultimately cast informed decisions. So with these very basic distinctions in mind, let me present you some data on what we research in Germany. And again, when I present this data to you, kind of the side effect of that is also giving you a little bit of insight maybe of day-to-day politics in Germany as it unfolds these days. It's difficult if there's no correspondence, of course. That's an interesting aspect. Where do we actually focus our attentions on which parts of the world? But German politics these days is quite intense, maybe also quite different compared to how it has been 10, 20, 30 years ago. So as a side effect of the talk, I would also give you some insights on what's actually happening in Germany and politics-wise these days. So my references to the politics aspect, the policy aspect, but also the idea of government by the people, the idea of a contestation. What I was trying to imply is that it takes information, that in large-scale modern kind of democracies, this information has to come from media, or at least from some sort of institutionalized setting, platform that provides information. And what we would usually use as indicators in our studies is we would just ask people, like, on how many days in the last week before the federal election campaign did you use the following sources of information to find out about the election campaign and the parties and the candidates running in the federal election? And of course, the perfect answer would be if just everybody would say, hey, I've been following this every single day, every single minute. But maybe that's not very realistic there. So it's an empirical question, what we actually see as the emerging pattern here. And what I will show you with this slide is actually that I think it's important to take two things into account that differentiate to what extent people actually do follow politics, or to what extent they think that politics is not really relevant, not really important to them. And that is age, the age of respondents, and the second factor is the interest in politics. I mean, some people find politics very interesting. Some even become political scientists, maybe ultimately. Others find it very boring. And in a way, that's fine. I mean, it's a free country. But still, democracy, politics, it's about this public good, the public decisions that are ultimately authoritatively taken for all of us. So we would want people to have some basic understanding, some basic interest in politics. So that's why I think to differentiate the electorate voters by their level of interest in politics is an important thing there. So when you look at this little graph, I hope you can see that also from the back, but you see 3 bars here. And these 3 bars show the average number of days that a person watches television to follow politics. And it's TV that we're looking at as a source of information, and we're looking at people. I know this sounds somewhat rude, but there are not as young as they used to be. Okay? And the 3 bars indicate 3 different levels of interest in politics. A medium, low, or medium level of interest to politics on the left side, an already high one in the middle, and a very high interest in politics on the right-hand side. And what I find striking here is that the differences by level of interest are very, very small. So even people not interested in politics, people of a certain age, they still follow politics in a very almost habitual way. They still follow politics on a very regular basis here. That's not true. That's the left-hand side here. If we look at online media, it's the same logic. So it's still same age group we're looking here at, but it's no longer TV as a source of information, but it's online media, whatever that means in detail. But we see kind of an increasing step here, increasing stairs, so to speak. So for these people to inform themselves in online worlds, that takes some interest in politics to really engage in that sort of information seeking and information reception. Now, if we turn to young people, and it has been mentioned, we've done some work. We actually just last week published a new study on young people and how they voted in the 2025 German election. So if we turn to young people and to what extent they receive information from TV, the level is very low. That shouldn't come as a surprise, I'm afraid, to most of us. And we see kind of this step-shaped pattern here as well. But you could say that's just a replacement of old media by new media. TV is replaced by television. But the really interesting pattern is this one. So young people, the stereotype would be they all follow social media for political information. But while we didn't see a very strong impact of level of interest for somewhat older people with respect to their TV consumption, we still see a significant effect of interest in politics for these younger ones. So young people not interested in politics, they are actually our key challenge in modern day democracies, because it's hard to reach them. It takes some interest in politics, but we also know that a lot of them don't have that basic interest in politics. We still would want them to have political information, but we see that we have a hard time to actually get the political information out to them. And I think that's really one of the key challenges. This group actually, when you look at turnout rates, when you look at other indicators of participation, this group, the combination of young age with low interest in politics, that's actually the group that puzzles us quite a bit. Because sometimes if they do vote, they might vote for rather, well, some would say extreme, but at least not mainstream parties. So this is kind of a key group that we really should keep an eye on. Still, I would argue, and this is, I know it's a lot of slides, and I hope from the back it's possible to at least or get an idea what it shows. I would still argue that it is possible to reach this group, but it takes much more effort. And these data actually, or these figures actually come from 2 recent studies that we have conducted with respect to young people. So this is only young people. To what extent do they follow, or do they read newspapers? Do they listen to radio? Do they watch TV? Use some sort of internet, online, social media information sources, or even use very modern things, as some would say, like podcasts or blogs. And it's the same logic. So the scale that we present to young people is 0 to 7 days, and the darker kind of the shading is, the more intense their media usage is. So the really dark parts of these graphs show that they use a certain source of information every single day. And the 2 elections that we compare here are European elections at the top and federal Parliament, Bundestag elections at the bottom. And the level of information, again, these are reported values by the young respondents, but the amount of information that according to their own self-reports they have received during the election campaigns between the European and the federal election is extremely different. So kind of the German word, I'm not sure whether that travels to Canada, would be the media pressure, actually. The German word would be the Mediendruck. So just the intensity with which a federal election campaign is covered compared to a second, some would even say third order election, which we often label the European elections as, the difference in the amount of information is so significant that we see these huge gaps with respect to how much information do young people receive. Now that of course means, if looked from a different perspective, things can change, but it really is no longer kind of a habit whether I follow an election or not, but it really depends on the situational, on the contextual features of a certain campaign, a certain issue, a certain whatever candidate maybe. It really depends on the context, on the situation, whether people do follow a certain aspect of politics or whether they do not. So we cannot take that for granted in a way. It's really more and more hard work to get the information out there. And that again is I think, a key challenge that we have in modern day democracies. I'll skip that for a second, but I wanted to show you this one because we digged a little deeper with when it comes to social media platforms. And again, this is also kind of the side effect that I talk about to give you an idea what the social media landscape looks like in Germany these days. Again, these are young people actually meaning 15 to 20-year-olds, so they're really young in that sense. And you see 5 different categories here: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, X, WhatsApp, and YouTube. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the individual categories here, it shows you, again, self-reports by our respondents, but what it shows you is to what extent they perceive posts on these different platforms as being political. Now, in the German context, Twitter, X, always was considered to be the most political platform. And if you look at, it's actually in the middle, if you look at the European election, the X-Twitter ones, yeah, there's some report of political content on social media, even more true for the federal election than it is true for the European election. But actually the highest share is reported for TikTok. And you could say that's a problem, or you can say, well, maybe that's an opportunity there. But as a matter of fact, it's just interesting to see that, because in the German context, TikTok is often seen as, or from people that have maybe no idea what's going on these platforms, but it's often seen as an almost apolitical platform. But the opposite is actually true. It is a very, very political platform. And if we look at some subgroups here, we actually see that people with lower levels of formal education, not trying to enter university, for example, or not aiming for a university career, they especially report high levels of TikTok usage and also high shares of political content. And if we keep in mind how difficult it traditionally has been to reach these groups of young voters, that's really an interesting combination here that I think we do not fully understand yet. Little bit of background again on the situation in Germany with respect to media usage, with respect to social media and the political relevance of these social media here. But let me start with my 5 bold claims that I promised at the beginning, with which I would like to maybe spark a little bit of controversy here. Let's see whether that's going to work out. If academics try to be really controversial, sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. We will see whether it's how it goes today. So the 5 bold claims are: where are the facts? There's way too much opinion in media reporting. There's too much politics. There's too little policy. That would be my second bold claim. We need better reporting on compromises. That would be the third one. What's the right balance? Actually, what's the false? What's the right balance when it comes to reporting on especially some political issues there? and why are people actually tired of the news. There's this idea, this concept of news fatigue in the literature. I will refer to that in the with respect to the fifth part of my 5 bold claims. So where are the facts? There's too much opinion actually out there. What I would like to argue is that we somehow we tend to forget that a lot of people might not have a perfect understanding of very complex issues. There's, again, another political scientist here, Philip Converse, who has put out this rather famous phrase, the 2 simplest truths I know about the distribution of political information in modern electorates are that first, the mean is low, and second, the variance is high. So a very skeptical, maybe realistic views of what people actually know about politics. And again, don't get me wrong, this is not new. Philip Converse has been around for quite some decades, actually, with his work on elections, campaigns. So this is nothing that has nothing to do per se with new media or social media. This is just something that he has described by looking at electoral studies throughout the world. The issue at stake here is that, so that's per se not new. But what we do observe is that trust in politics actually goes down. Trust in media actually does go down. Trust in science does go down. We can measure that with our surveys quite convincingly over time. And the combination of a low level of trust with a lack of knowledge, that actually does pose a problem. Because that, as you can see in a number of analyses, that actually needs to opposition, to actually disapproval, to even lower trust in the processes, in government, in parties. So that's actually where the change comes from. If you're a trusting person, if you have trust in media, if you trust the government, you don't have to know a lot about things because you trust these people that they will do the right thing. But if the trust for some reason is gone, then low levels of knowledge all of a sudden pose a major problem, because the trust no longer is there as a source of information, as a source of approval. But when factual knowledge is also missing, then what else should there be that could kind of inspire or lead to approval, lead to support for certain measures with respect to climate change, or with respect also to the pandemic, where we have seen these kinds of patterns. And you already saw the picture for a second, because I was too fast here in switching to the next slide. We have to deal with extremely complex issues these days. The corona pandemic was, of course, a prime example, but these kinds of maps, heat maps, I mean, if you think about it for a moment, they're really difficult to understand if you're not used to reading these kinds of maps. But in the pandemic, but also in the context of migration, in the context of climate change, these are, in a way, very scientific debates. And quite automatically, a lot of scientific studies are referenced, a lot of statistics are used, indicators are used, but we don't really know, well, actually we do know that it's, to put it mildly, very difficult for people to follow this, to understand this. Or you could also say, for a lot of people, they just do not understand what's going on, and they might have a feeling that this is completely overwhelming, that for them, that it actually means there will be some burdens, some costs, some financial implications, and this is something we really have to keep in mind. Just to give you a very small idea, and this is some small piece of research that we've conducted. You see there's this trending pattern on this graph here that I'll show you. It's actually, that's the way we presented it to our respondents in a survey. It's supposed to display the water level of a lake. And it goes up and down because there are seasons. In the winter, there's more precipitation, so there's the water level actually rises, and then in summer the water level goes down. So it's actually pretty obvious in a way that it does go up and down. But you see, the trend ends actually on a high point, so to speak, on a local maximum, because that's the summertime in a way. So we had one group to which we showed this graph, and we had another group to which we showed this graph. It's exactly the same trend, with the only exception being that the end point is a local minimum, because it's a winter point in time. It's December, I think, actually, rather than June. But that's the only difference. I mean, mathematically, they're exactly identical. But what we find is that the support for more measures against climate change, they're actually significantly higher if we show people the right hand, or the graph on the right-hand side, compared to the graph on the left-hand side. So just by manipulating this very little tiny piece of information, whether the graph ends at a high point, a local high point, or a local low, a local minimum, does change to what extent people are willing to support climate change measures. We did similar studies in the context of the pandemic, where you also had these cyclical patterns rather on a weekly basis. The support for tightening corona measures actually also depended, or we could manipulate that in a way, just by letting the graph end either on a high or a low point. And now you can think that's funny, or it shows how easily people can be manipulated. But I would rather argue it shows how fragile information or knowledge actually is, and how complex these kinds of graphs are possibly to ordinary citizens, to viewers of TV news or whatever, and that we really have to keep that in mind. And again, I think what's sorry. The bubble at the top is the one that popped up. It's again the importance of age in interaction with education, or with interest in politics, that matters there. We see that especially people not used to reading these kinds of graphs, not reading maps, not being sort of confronted with certain pieces of information, with maybe academic evidence, that they are struggling with it, and that for them it actually does cause objection to these kinds of measures. And of course it implies, because we, in kind of context here, we were interested in journalism, it implies that the pieces that are produced have to be factually correct, of course, but they have to be very easily accessible as is possible in a very complex world there, I guess. Second bold claim. So 2 little facts there, maybe too much opinion. I didn't talk too much about the opinion, I know, but that was kind of implicit. I was rather complaining about maybe there's a lack of just pieces that explain things, pieces that present facts in a very accessible ways, So that was the first part there. Too much politics, too little policy. Now keep in mind, politics is the process, policy is the ultimate outcome, the substance of politics. What you often find in political science, kind of campaign literature, is this portrayal of campaign coverage as using game frames, as if politics were some football final, or some race to some ultimate, be it 100-meter or a marathon or whatever, but it has these sports-like metaphors very often. Horse race journalism is often a phrase that is used to portray that. And you could say, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's the politics, the process of politics is interesting. And that can be true for some people, but maybe for others it's not. And maybe they find this game framing way to report politics actually is not personally relevant for them, because they don't care about the process. Maybe they care about outcomes ultimately. But this, again, is something that has become more important, as some content analyses for Germany, but also comparative content studies have shown. There's more and more game framing. Just another, you'd be disappointed if I wouldn't have a slide here with data. So this is actually the attention given to polls, surveys, polls in German election campaigns. This is the 2021 example. but either one of the last 5 or 6 elections would look very, very similar. So from left to right, election day comes closer, and what you see here is that the attention given to polls, devoted to polls, basically doubles from 40 to almost 80%. So people receive a lot of poll-based information, and this poll-based information is a typical example of kind of this horse race game frame kind of journalism. +1 here, -1 here, this party's falling behind, this one is catching up. That's typical, and just listen to some of the metaphors that are used in reporting on present day campaigns. There's a lot of sports in there, and again, you can find that very interesting, but maybe the right balance, we should actually have an eye on that. There are some formats, TV formats, that further increase this tendency for game framing, for sports-like reporting on campaigns. So this is a very typical example of a German TV format that's been established in campaigns ever since 2002. And the interesting thing here is, do you know what these formats are called in the German context? So the analogy would be kind of these US-style televised debates, right? And debate, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the debate. The interesting thing about the German thing, is that we call it a duel. And I mean, you can say, okay, different country, different language, whatsoever, but labeling it as a duel, as if there were like the ultimate showdown with possibly one of the contestants being out of the race at the end of that duel, it always has this idea of who's winning, who's losing, who made a point, who hit the other one, who lost in a way. And this winning, losing, that's what politics is about. So you can say it's naive what I'm saying, but I again think it's about the right balance here between politics and policy, and maybe especially in campaign times, this politics perspective has become slightly too dominant there, at the expense, of course, of the policy aspect that people might think is more relevant to their personal life. One last thing here, again, giving you a little bit of insight to German politics in recent years. I don't know whether you have ever heard of this Building Energy Act. The German abbreviation for that is GEG. That's just the German translation for that. Gebäudeenergiegesetz, you can forget about that. But it has become a symbol really of the struggling of the former coalition that we had in Germany, the former coalition being the one of Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals. We've never had that before, but we had it from 21 up until 2024, until November. And it was a difficult coalition. I'll talk about this in a minute. But they had this idea that that's why it's called the Building Energy Act, that the way homes would be heated in Germany, that needs a fundamental reform, carbon neutral ways to heat homes. It's been a green project in a way, but it has really become the symbol of intense fightings within the government, but also with when it comes to government opposition patterns, their relationships there, and all these screenshots on the left-hand side are from the most famous German tabloid media, the Bild Zeitung. They've been really focusing on that issue for basically the entire summer of 23. The right-hand side, that's a share pick from a right-wing populist candidate, and he's basically saying here this, they labeled it the heating hammer. Doesn't travel well in language-wise, but it's been very extreme language, and it's basically it's robbery. It takes away money from ordinary people. So some combination of right-wing populists with parts of the media system, it's really been a very dominant, intense topic on a thing that had actually been agreed on in the coalition contract that the three parties had agreed to in 21 when they founded the coalition. Why am I saying this? Because there was one little minor poll that was presented on German television where people were asked, how well informed do you feel about the federal government's plans to reform heating systems? And the 4 bars you see there show the level of informedness, so to speak, from very well, not so well, to not at all. So basically, we have a situation where the whole country debates in a very intense and polarized way, discusses this issue, but you see hardly, or what is it, 23% if you add up the 2 left bars, less than a quarter of people actually had the sense that they knew what the discussion was about. And that's not very helpful in a way, to put it mildly. And if you look at subgroups by party orientation, it's basically true for each and every camp of party supporters. Christian Democrats, they now have the chancellor. AfD, they are the right-wing populists. The liberals, the social democrats. For each of these camps, you find about 20% supporting or saying they know what it's about, whereas more than 80% would say, hey, I have no idea what this is actually about. The Greens being the only one, the Green supporters being the only ones where you have almost a balance there. So again, that's why I would argue there's something wrong here between policy as substance versus politics as a process. And I think we have maybe to think about that and have a little bit more focus on policy issues in terms of the substance of politics there. Now, contradicting what I said just now, the third bold claim that I have here is that we need better reporting on compromises. And why is that a contradiction? Because compromises, of course, that's a process in itself too. You need negotiations. You need, it might take hours, days, weeks to come up, to finally agree on these compromises. So maybe it's not so much about the politics, the process as such, but maybe we also have to look at the way we present certain processes, especially the way we look at compromises. And again, let me briefly give you 1 or 2 ideas here, especially what I would like to argue here is that the times have become more difficult to actually come up with compromises. These are German elections ever since 1949. That's the first post-war German election. And the last one, of course, is 2025, just in February. And in political science, we sometimes use this effective number of parties, which is basically a weighted average of the parties that run, or that how they do in certain elections, what their vote shares is. A smaller party would have lower weight. I mean, it's almost trivia when I say it like that, but that's the idea here. All I'm trying to show you is that just the complexity of the party system has increased significantly, some would even say dramatically. German politics in the 70s and the 80s, we had 2.5 parties with a PR, proportional representation system, but it was 2 large parties, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and kind of the liberals being in between, 2.5 party system. Now we are basically at 5, 6 parties in parliament. The situation looks very different at certain state level governments. So finding compromises under these circumstances has become more and more challenging, more and more difficult. If you look at actually where these parties are in terms of policies, we often use these 2-dimensional spaces to characterize German politics. We use kind of this economic left-right continuum from rather left state-oriented ideas with respect to economic, fiscal, social policies towards rather market-oriented policies on the right-hand side, but going from bottom or from up to lower to the upper part, that's more like a cultural dimension. Wokeness as maybe just a signal here. To what extent do people or do parties have rather traditional views on certain moral, religious, cultural issues? To what extent are they rather progressive? And that little circle that I added to the slide, that was the coalition we had from 21 to 24, the so-called traffic light coalition, because it consisted of the red Social Democrats, the yellow Liberals, and the green Greens. These are the colors they use in a German context. And what you see with respect to that coalition, they were on different sides of the spectrum when it came to fiscal, social, economic policies. Social Democrats and Greens being rather left parties, Liberals being rather market-oriented parties in the German sense. I know you use the term liberal here in a slightly different way, but that would be the German economically liberal perspective here. So they'd actually push or pull in different directions here. But with respect to cultural issues, they were pretty much in line here. They could agree on that. They actually gave themselves the label Progress Coalition, but ultimately they had to deal with a lot of fiscal, social, economic, tax questions, and ultimately that became so intense that they would no longer be able to work together, and the coalition collapsed. The current coalition we have is a coalition of Social Democrats at the bottom left part and Christian Democrats rather being on the upper right-hand part. So they're even further apart on both dimensions. And I'm still talking about compromises because these coalitions, they have to ultimately agree on compromises. But they're actually pulling in different directions. They still manage to find compromises, but they're really tough ones. They're hurtful even for the party members and party voters. But I would argue, despite the fact that they're so different, that they're located on different sides of the political spectrum, the fact that they still find compromises is a major cultural achievement. It's a major achievement of democracies. But if we then see headlines like this, presenting these compromises as kind of foul ones, shallow ones, thin ones, there's no appreciation for these kinds of compromises. And of course, journalism, media, fourth power, this idea of being critical, being watchdogs, I agree 100%. But we also have to find a way to kind of acknowledge what an achievement these compromises are. And I think there's also some need for maybe a small readjustment here and there. The two last ones, I can be very brief here. The fourth one was the one about the balance. To what extent do we need a right or false versus a right balance? We asked the question actually in one of our survey questions here. We asked people, to what extent do you agree to this statement here? Voices that deny climate change should not be given a platform in the media. And you see the distribution of answers here with respect to male, female, and also with respect to different age groups. And the agreeing, the level of supporting this statement is very high among young people. So it's not a consensus, but there's more agreement, there's more support among young people when it comes to not giving space, not giving room to certain voices with respect to climate change. But it's very different with respect to older age groups, where we again see we have a very different electorate out there. We have very different groups out there in the electorate among the public. There's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution there. And again, that's, I think, the major struggle, that we have so many different demands out there with respect to false balance, with respect to the level of complexity, with respect to the question, do we want politics in the media at all or not? I think that's really a key thing here. I would like to stress another aspect with respect to false versus right balance. Remember those things I showed you at the beginning of my presentation when I was talking about Instagram, TikTok, and that TikTok and other platforms, but especially TikTok, was so political. Well, we asked a follow-up question to that and asked our young respondents, well, when you think of parties, what do you actually see? Which parties do you see on your social media accounts? And that's, I think, a false balance there that we really should keep in mind. Two things here. So you see the question at the top, did certain parties appear on your social media platforms? Did they appear particularly often? And if so, which party appeared most often? And first of all, 60 to 80% of people say, yeah, I saw some parties, they were dominant in my feeds. And when we then ask them, well, which one was it? It's the right-wing populists. And to an extent, I mean, this is 40, 60. We see some groups where this rises to 80%. We would not accept any newspaper, any public television to have such a skewed distribution of party presence. But we do accept it with respect to social media. We would sometimes say, well, the others just have to try harder, which is simply not true. They have tried very, very hard. So there's something about algorithms here, and I think that's actually a key question when it comes to balance, false balance, that we really have to keep in mind. Very final thing, why are people tired of the news? Well, they're complex times, and you would just ask them, why are you tired of the news? Why do you not follow news? And I think I myself have to move here because I can't read the very tiny answers there on the left. First of all, we did ask them, well, what's your media usage like, right? And the purple share at the top, these are people that say, I don't follow news at all. The red ones at the bottom, these are actually people that say, I need political information, I need media coverage of politics every single day. And the two in between ones are, well, I follow news when it just pops up in my news feed or in my mailbox or wherever. And the green bars, these are people, and they're obviously the most present one. These are the ones that would say, yeah, I follow it, but maybe not every single day. So kind of an intermediate position. So there is some fatigue out there, but we shouldn't stress that too much, right? It's not true to portray citizens as being completely apolitical. It's more a question of how do we actually reach them. When we ask them, can I take this mic for a second here actually? When we ask them why do you not follow the news, the most often given answer is because the news upset or frighten me. So this idea that the reporting is too negative, it scares people, it frightens people, that's actually quite a thing there. Now, the world is as it is, right? So it's kind of hard to change that, but we have to acknowledge that, that people are scared by this kind of news. Because I don't trust them, that's the second most often stated answer. And the third one is actually because I do not have the time. And if we look at this by gender, and these are the final slides that I have, if we look at it by gender, this frightening aspect is, we see that very dominant among female respondents, whereas the trusting one, the distrust is rather a male answer. With respect to age categories, we see that trust, low levels of trust, is especially prominent among older respondents. Whereas for younger ones, we especially see this time competition in a way. They say, I mean, we can't prove whether that's the case, but they say that they don't have the time to actually follow the news in more detail. So again, it's very, very complicated here. And in a nutshell, all I've been trying to say is that I think that there's a dilemma here with the clicker, but also, but also a dilemma between what we would want from a systemic, democratic point of view. We would like to have people that have a high interest in politics, that are very open for discourse, that follow the news every single day. But if we look at the individuals these days, we see a lot of heterogeneity. We see some parts of society, of the electorate, where actually the interest in politics is rather low, where there is a tendency for belief preservation. I just would like to stay the world as it is. I would like to believe, to keep on believing what I have believed for the last 10, 20, 30 years. And that's kind of the dilemma here. The German Constitutional Court, with respect to media, has come up with this idea of informationelle Grundversorgung. There has to be a basic supply of political information for each and every one. But I actually think that we're struggling with that, and we haven't come up with really good solutions to that. I apologize that I've been slightly over time here, but I'm really grateful for all the attention you've given me. Thank you very much.
thank you so much to Thorsten. You gave us so much useful information and a lot to think about. I guess now I should introduce myself, and I'm a journalism fellow. We're all journalism fellows here at Massey College. And should we get right into it, Emily, or do you think we should do some intro? Okay, great. Well, so I yes, I'd love to. You certainly gave us a lot to think about, and having original research that countered some of my long-held beliefs, some of my belief preservation. So there's a few things I wanted to talk about. One is that it's young people, it's very clear, are getting so much information on social media, but as you pointed out, that doesn't mean they're not getting political information. They are getting political information. It's just from a different source. And I have a belief, well, I stole it from someone. In the 1980s, the mid-1980s, there was a book that came out called Amusing Ourselves to Death in the US by a guy named Neil Postman. And he was arguing in the age of television, but he said that basically democracy requires a degree of print media, that it requires citizens to engage with text over images. And now what we are seeing is the total collapse of print media that even Postman couldn't have reckoned with. And so we're not seeing a post-political or a post-educated generation, but we are seeing something of a post-literate generation, that you can have an entire generation of people who are growing up without reading much, even as they're hyper-political. And so I guess my first question for you would be, do you have any thoughts on how crucial reading is, how crucial text is to an engaged and informed citizenry, or do you think that social media can replace it pretty well, given that it engages young people with politics to such a high degree?
First of all, I agree with the analysis that newspapers have fulfilled a certain function. Maybe also this is true for listening to radio stations, but I think the crucial aspect here is that you have kind of curated media products that expose people to political information, even though they might only read the newspaper for maybe the sports part or the local news or maybe even other things, the ads or whatsoever. But as a byproduct, they would still get this basic level, this basic amount of political information that I think is really crucial. So in a more abstract sense, not sure whether it's really the mode, whether you read it or whether you listen to it or whether you watch it on television, but it's really this idea of having kind of the full package of information that for sure includes some level of political information. And I mean, you can actually see that, and there are very interesting studies there also for the US at the time when you would have parts of the countries where there would still be newspapers present, whereas you would have, while at the same time you would have other parts where they had already gone. And that's almost like a natural experiment, right? Where you can compare these two different regions. And you did find that the level of knowledge, for example, knowledge about politics, that would be significantly different. And I would say it's not the people that are different. That would be a strange idea. I mean, maybe there's something to it that people self-select into certain contexts, but it's not the whole story. So I think it's really about the environment, the information environment, and I think that has really changed. And the final slide I had with the struggle, so to speak, between the systemic perspective and the very individualistic perspective. I mean, if you are, as a Canadian or a German, if your life goal is to watch 24 hours of football, it's easily doable these days. If you want to watch hockey 24 hours a day, hey, I'm sure you can do that as well.
I'm trying.
Well, and for you that's perfect, but maybe for democracy it's not, right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of, that's exactly the thing that where we kind of, where the balance between what do we want as a society, as a democratic society, might be different from what each and every individual wants, and the context, the environment, the information environment that we have these days rather pushes that balance towards the individual, but that has a cost for democracy. And I think newspapers, the reading in the sense, were rather a way to transmit information that was rather on the more systemic democratic side of that
Right.
dichotomy.
Can you say that one more time, sir? The way that we read newspapers was more democratic?
Not necessarily the way we read it, but the way the product newspaper, the thing I had in my hand, it would just have a balanced portfolio of political information, local information, national information, sports. But if and people would just, you know, by habit, maybe they would just leaf through the paper, but they would receive some sort of information by default, by habit. And I think that's actually no longer there. If I may add one more thing, we tend to talk about social media as if they were all the same. And I think that's actually not true either. I think there was a time, and maybe Twitter in a way was the symbol for that, where you as the user would select, okay, I want to follow you, I want to follow you, I want to follow you, also you, of course, but maybe not others. But it was up to me to select the accounts that I would follow. Whereas these reels, the TikTok logic, I mean, it's not driven by my preference to the same extent, but it's really driven by the algorithm. And so it's interesting that we see so much politics. Not sure whether that's true for Canada as well. I'd be interested in your views on that. But I was surprised to see so much politics on German TikTok for the young people. But maybe that's an algorithmic thing where the algorithm recognizes, hey, they like some stuff.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to say, Professor Faas, first of all, thank you so much for coming to Massey and for taking us through your findings. My name is Pasent. I'm one of the journalism fellows here, along with my peers here. And I'm really, I have to say, I was really fascinated by what you've offered us in terms of young people. And the snapshot that we've gotten of them, which is that they don't trust media. They're mostly on TikTok. I was struck by the graph about how one of the reasons they don't really pay attention to the news is they don't have the time. And I feel I'm quite fascinated by this kind of migration of Gen Z and younger people away from mainstream traditional media towards these other platforms. And from my vantage point, and I'm curious to know what you think of this, I see it as a kind of perfect storm of this mistrust of the media. And I was really, again, fascinated by the graph that showed that young people do not think that climate change deniers should be platformed. They're very clear on that, whereas the rest of us old people are like, oh, maybe not. I mean, for the record.
I prefer not young.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So in a way, I have mixed feelings on this, but I overwhelmingly sometimes feel that younger voters, younger media consumers are somehow seen as perhaps naive, perhaps overly optimistic. But what I see is a clarity. I see a clarity in younger people that I think we would do well to learn from. We've lost them, essentially. I worked at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation for 10 years. And I saw, we do a lot right, but I can see, for example, just the way that news is presented in this, objective view from nowhere type of way, we lose people, especially when they can see the truth right in front of them. So I'm wondering if you can maybe give us a little bit of your insights as to what do you think is happening with young people specifically, and how do we, I don't want to say win them back, but maybe how do we adapt to them and their dynamics, because that's essentially the future. And I think we're writing them off a little bit. Not you, but in general.
No, thank you for that. I fully agree, I think, to what you've said. I'm always somewhat reluctant to use this Gen Z kind of language, because if we if we label them as a generation, it somehow creates this picture that they're a rather homogenous group, which they are not. In fact, if you look at their vote choices, but also their attitudes, they're very, very heterogeneous. They're probably the most heterogeneous group we have in German society, at least these days. Sometimes we would use these contrasting groups, young women living in urban contexts that have rather high levels of education, in contrast to young men living rather in rural parts of the country with rather low levels of education. I mean, the gap is huge. So this talk about this modern gender gap between young women, young men, that's real, and especially if you add the educational element to it. So I fully agree. I would just be more reluctant to portray them as this homogenous group. I do think that we sometimes portray them as naive, and that is completely off. It's completely wrong in a way. In this most recent study that we did, we, for example, asked them about their motivations to vote for certain parties, and we also asked that for older people, and this kind of motivational approach yielded basically identical results for all age groups. So it's not that they form their decisions in a fundamentally different way. I think they have different positions on some issues. Again, they themselves are heterogeneous, but still on average they're still different from older age groups. And we have no clue how they're, I mean, I couldn't show you all of this, of course, but basically no one beyond 40 uses TikTok in Germany these days, more or less. I mean, there are always exceptions, but more or less. So we have no clue, actually, of what their information environment looks like, whether it's good or bad. We tend to label it as bad, but we have no clue, actually, what it looks like. And so I guess that would be the first step there. We could move on to talk about political representation. Do we need more younger people in parliament and the whole story? But there's definitely just in terms of understanding each other, recognizing what their everyday life looks like. I think we have hardly a clue there what they actually do see, and but we tend to label it as bad, and I think that's definitely not the way to move forward.
All right, so I thank you, Prof, for coming. I come from a slightly different society. I'm a journalist. My name is Bless Ayong. I'm part of the Journalism Fellows. I come from Cameroon in West, some people say Central Africa. I think some of the information you shared with us today, I think it's what I've witnessed back home. You know, a lot of young people get a lot of their information on social media, especially, you know, what we refer to as Gen Zs. But I think unlike in Germany, as you've explained, working as a journalist in the Cameroonian context, for example, it's much different with what you have in Germany. For example, you said there are sometimes too many opinions, and then where are the facts? Or you also mentioned that there are very little policies, but a lot of politics. I come from a society where journalists really want to talk about the politics. They want to bring the facts, but it's also extremely dangerous to do so. And so you have an audience who are interested in knowing the facts, knowing about how the economy is doing, how healthcare infrastructure is doing, but they are too afraid to share these facts, because they may go to prison for that, or they may disappear, something like that. And then you also have young people who are interested. They're genuinely interested because they've grown up. Maybe their parents have retired and they have not had their pension. They don't know what's happening, if the schools will resume or not. All of those things. They want to know, where the country is going to. They sometimes ask you as journalists, why are you not reporting on these critical issues? But you know that it's extremely dangerous to do so. So this is, for me, it's not a question. It's kind of I've just learned that I think in a society like Canada and Germany, people have the opportunity, I would say journalists have the opportunity to bring out the facts, bring out the policies. Sometimes they don't always, do that. Whereas I come from a place where people demand, in private conversations, they want to have this information. But again, you cannot share this information, or you would have to share this information with a little compromise, just so that you stay safe. Yeah, that's just my observation.
Well, thank you very much for that as well, because, I mean, of course, I should have made that more clear. I basically was talking about, in Freedom House terminology, free countries or free press, free media systems, democracies, and of course there are contestations to democracies throughout the world, I would say, but still it might be a major difference to what extent, or what your starting point is, maybe, to put it that way. And again, that's why when I talked about the compromises, I mean, free media and a media fulfilling kind of this watchdog function is absolutely key to a democracy, but at the same time, we have to find a way to do it in a democracy compatible way, so to speak, so that the reporting, especially on compromises, doesn't ultimately lead people to vote for populist parties, because they would argue that all these compromises, that's just wrong per se, right? So that's kind of the dilemma that we have there. That's actually, I don't have a solution for that, and I didn't want to create the impression that I have, but I think that's just a major challenge, that we have certain things in mind, how they're supposed to work, but all of a sudden we have these contestations from within that we have to deal with now, and that kind of requires to maybe find or shift balances here and there. Also another difference, and maybe, I don't know whether you have ideas on that, but of course young people are a rather small group in Germany, so they are not important politically, if you put it very directly. So that's another aspect why they might not be all that interested in certain contexts.
I just in Cameroon, young people are 70% of the population. So that tells you how important they are, and they're the driving force of the country. But somehow they are the minority, because their voice has been silenced, and every tool like journalism and like critical thinking has been stifled in such a way that they've been locked up.
Like in the German election in February, 40%, that was for the first time, more than 40% of eligible voters were 60 plus. Just to give you an idea where the power is, right? And I think that's just something to keep in mind. That's why, I mean, it's fascinating what you're saying, that they're a majority but a minority at the same time. That's a fascinating idea, actually. Thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Vinita Srivastava. I've been a journalist for about 30 years in New York City and in Toronto, and I've also taught journalism. So the context for me is that I've seen kind of these waves, and the conversation that you started today makes me think about 20 years ago, and I'm not sure if it's about 20 years ago when I'm talking about Arab Spring, and I'm talking about the real excitement that there was for a new kind of social media, like a wresting of power from the folks that determined the news that we read every day. So when you talk about the programming that happens in the newspaper, well, I used to work at the New York Times, and you would see like who got to sit at that head table. And I was an outsider of that head table, but that head table was mostly men, and mostly white men, who were determining what we spoke about and what we read every day. So when Arab Spring and the idea of, the internet, this idea of this exciting power being taken out of the hands of those folks was fantastic. And I think then too, there was this conversation about, young people are losing interest. But actually, no, they were losing interest in what you were talking about, Pasent. It's you lose interest and you lose trust in what is being determined for you to read. And so you create something else over here. And I think we're seeing some aspect of that now in some kind of local news products. But what you spoke today about is kind of a scary algorithm that's kind of determining that for us and for young folks. And so I'm wondering a little bit if you've had some time to think about that algorithm and how much power that has, and how we can mess with that a little bit.
Well, first of all, thank you also for this perspective, because in a way, I was portraying this picture of the good old days, but of course they had deficiencies as well. And so I guess in a more neutral way, what I was trying to say is that we maybe we need to find new balances here and there, and maybe not overshoot in one or the other direction. But thank you for that. I mean, that's absolutely true. Algorithm-wise, there's been a fascinating study just published in Germany by a foundation there where they, and I'm sure that has been done in other countries as well, where they basically set up new accounts on actually TikTok and try to keep them neutral. I mean, whatever that means in a way. But it was really impressive to see how quickly these fake newsers were confronted with actually party content from the AfD, the right-wing populist, actually in the most recent election also from the left party, but not from the other parties, even though all these other parties were trying. That's why I think it's too easy to sort of blame the parties, saying, well, you guys, you just don't try hard enough. I don't think that's true, actually. I think all of them are trying really hard, but they're just not as successful, and the algorithm is obviously at work there. I'm not an information scientist, so I'm not going to talk about algorithms here. All I would say is that at least in the German context, being a certain, media system relying to a large part on very local regional newspapers, but also having some national newspapers in a kind of New York Times way, but then also having private and public broadcasting, radio, television-wise, ever since the 80s. But there was still a lot of regulation there, also for the private television networks. So, for example, in the run-up to elections, they were required to show campaign ads almost for free. Now, if you just transfer that simple idea to TikTok or whatever your preferred platform is, that would mean you log on to TikTok, first of all. The first thing you do is you have to watch a campaign ad by some random party. I mean, sometimes they're weird, that has part of the story too. But at least that was kind of thought to be important, that there'd be space for these parties to present themselves. And I think there might be ways to take these logics of old media, still take them to new media. I mean, you're now forced to watch ads on Instagram all the time. I guess they call it ad break. I don't know. The German one is ad break actually. So then I have to wait for 30 seconds and I have to watch this ad before I can watch whatever I want to see. And of course you could use exactly the same logic for political parties, as we have done in the old days for newspapers. They would have cheaper ways to have their ads there, or which has been done for radio, for television. I think we're slightly, again, it's easy for me to say that here on a nice Tuesday morning, but things can be done, things can be changed. Also with respect, even if we don't have to be, they don't have to publish in an open, transparent way their algorithm. I mean, I don't know whether they're ever going to do that, but you could still ask them to do certain things that might help democracy parties a discourse. I think there are ways in between there.
So at this point, I'd like to open up to any questions that people in the audience might have. And if anyone just wants to raise their hand. Emily can come around with a microphone.
Hello, my name is Ian Mitchell. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the questions and the comments. I have a question about the idea of education and information. And the reason I just want to explain, when I was doing my doctorate in international relations, I was doing it in the UK. I had a colleague who said to me once in passing, we were discussing politics, and she said, politics has always been an elite project. That was her point of view. And there's something about that. I'm not dismissing the fact that if you looked at the people who are engaged in politics, there's an obvious indication that that's true. But I was disturbed by the idea then that politics is something of an exclusive game, the way that you frame it. And that somehow there's the idea of all those other people who aren't involved in politics, if they were just educated, or if they were just better informed, we wouldn't have this problem anymore. Their decisions would be different. And I find that idea in itself disturbing. Because, I'm the child of immigrants to Canada from ordinary working class people who were not really involved in politics. But they had their opinions, they had their views and values and so on and so forth. And what I find disturbing is the idea that if we just educated more people or informed more people, somehow we would reach this consensus again. And if you're an environmentalist, you might say we've been working for years to convince people to phase out nuclear power or whatever your particular interest is. And then there are people on the other side of the spectrum who say we're very unhappy about the way our society is now. We need to do something about immigration, or whatever the case is. So I just wonder, how do you allow for dynamics in politics if it's really a question of a certain kind of education, a certain kind of information? Thank you.
They're paying to hear you.
No, it's all good. I'll try to handle that. Well, thanks for that as well. That's kind of in the way the fascinating thing about democracy, that if you look at who are actually the people that change their vote choices from one election to the next, oftentimes you find that they have this medium level of interest in politics. Those who have a very strong interest in politics, they usually have certain parties that they identify with, and that they oftentimes vote for throughout the entire course of their life. Now, whether that's good or bad is a different thing, and I see your point that maybe I was, or you understood it as being a too negative portrayal of certain groups of society. I think you mentioned that you've dealt with misinformation and these things before. I think where we might have a problem is when people do receive information from whichever sources that's the case, and they're not able to put it in a context. Maybe let me put it that way, to question whether that can be true or not. Whether this kind of competence to just have some previous information maybe to contrast new information with, and this idea that I mentioned in closing of this a basic level of political information that has to be provided to each and every one, that the German Constitutional Court came up with at some point in time. I quite like that idea. And I think where we might have a slight, or not disagreement, but a different starting point there, is that what worries me are actually people that have very little interest in politics, that might still receive certain pieces of information by certain formats, channels, whatsoever, and that are then heavily influenced by these single bits of information, whether they're right or wrong, whether that actually, there's, and I know it has this kind of almost paternalistic perspective, me telling what's right or wrong. I fully see that point, and I mean that's part of democracy. Decisions are taken the way they're taken, period. But there are some studies out there that when we talk about who believes misinformation, that's something I think we have to worry about. And what worries me there is that we have parts of society that where the interest is low, where the kind of level of information they receive is rather low, but when they then receive whatever piece of information that has a tremendous importance for them all of a sudden, and I'm not sure whether that's really helpful.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Nina Wichmann. I have a question, and your response to Ian might have been a good segue into that. I'm wondering if you found in your research, and maybe you're especially from Cameroon, in your life experience from Cameroon, that young people, especially on social media, are also consuming a lot of political or quasi-political information, but from other countries, because that's now possible. When I was young and my mom was young, we had to go to the main train station and buy a printed New York Times, for 20 Deutschmarks to get that information. Now it pops up in my Insta first thing in the morning. I read about policies from the United States. And in Germany, sometimes, especially during electoral campaigns, I had this impression that arguments or the ways the system might function are influenced a lot by this pitching winner-takes-all system of the United States. And I was inclined to think, oh, but the German system works differently, and this doesn't quite do it. Also, the way the duels are often staged are very lean, very much toward how it's done in the United States, and yet has to serve another purpose, because these people often have to then form a coalition in the end. And in Cameroon, I lived in West Africa, and I'm certain it's not comparable, but I found that many young people, especially because it was sometimes hard to obtain information within the West African media on certain topics, consumed a lot of, as we all do, British and American media, but then were so influenced by those arguments that I sometimes thought, and again, I also don't want to be paternalistic or maternalistic, but I thought, in your system and with your politicians, you probably need to be asking slightly different questions, but because the information from the Western media was so predominant for them, I found the public debates, were influenced by arguments from other political systems in West Africa, but also in Germany. Is that a factor, especially for the political mindset and the forming of it in young people, or not so much?
I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer for that, because we didn't include that specifically in our study. I mean, we sometimes would ask for to what extent they follow international news, but that's different actually. That's more the New York Times you mentioned that you buy maybe at some whatever train station kind of booths. So I don't have a really empirical answer to that. Maybe apart from the fact that, of course, but that again is trivia. The platforms per se are less national than traditional media outlets would have been, right? So I guess there's a role there. If you think of the role, I don't know to what extent that was covered here in Canada, the role Elon Musk as a person played in the German campaign, openly supporting the right-wing populists. I mean, that's quite remarkable, but it's not really an answer to your question, of course. So I'm afraid I don't really have a good one on that.
Well, I could say we do have to wrap up, but in Canada, we see that too. A lot of we're so close to the United States that a lot of our political discourse is sort of imported from the United States. That's true both with ideas and at the party level. And I would argue even at the protest level in some degrees that things that can happen in the U.S. Spill over here in part because we consume so much news
I could say my
from the U.S.
16-year-old daughter told me that for 2 days all she got was New York Mayor news. At least 2 days, but maybe 5 days. It was all New York City all the time.
Well, on that note, we have to end up. Thank you so much, Professor. If we could get a round of applause. Thanks so much for the professor for giving us the time. Thanks to Massey. Thanks to the German consulate for being a great partner of Massey.
Yes, again, I'll echo Jordan, but Thorsten, Jordan, Pacent, Blaise, and Vanita, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful conversation. You're welcome to continue the conversation. There's lunch served in the common room, so if you exit these back doors and come back around in here, we can sit down and continue. So thank you.